How you doing? This is Fred and welcome back at the Thomann Drum Bass channel. In this episode, it's all about preparing your drum samples to get them from a studio production to your drum set. What do we need for that? A computer with studio tracks, a drum set and some electronic drums. So let's go. For perfect samples, we have to follow some rules or workflow. And it doesn't matter if we're talking about drum samples, vocal chops, melodic stuff and much more you can play with the electronic drums. And it's up to you what software you want to use to prepare your samples, like Ableton, Cubase, Pro Tools, you name it. For my own workflow, I like to use Logic Pro, and here are the steps. So, for your first cut, zoom in as close as possible to the beginning of the sample. On one hand, we don't want to cut transients, and on the other hand, we don't want space in front of the sample to play it as tight as possible. And for sure, the correct cut at the end of the sample is important too, because we don't want to cut reverbs or delays that are included in the sound. A good way is to cut right before the next impact. And this leads into rule number 3. Always do some smooth fade outs to avoid cracking noises at the end of the sample. To export correctly, move the sample to the beginning of the bar and adjust the cycle length properly. Then check the volume. Try to export as loud as possible, but without clipping in your software. Then the export. Check the audio file settings that are supported by your drum module. Then name it carefully to find it later after you've imported it to your drum module. And last but not least, import them to your module. Let's get to today's example. I've prepared a tune with electronic produced drums. Imagine you got multi-tracks sent from your producer or a band member. Let's listen to the original tracks first. Now listen to all tracks separately with the solo function. We got a bass drum track, then 2 clap sounds, and a percussion loop. Now we've checked out the song and noticed that the drums are made out of 4 tracks. Bass drum, 2 different claps and a loop that contains shaker and tambourine. Our aim is to get the produced drums played on the drums we already have. Today, in addition to my Thomann Star Classic drums, I'm using the TM6 Pro trigger module with a bass drum and snare drum trigger and 2 pads. So what's our status quo? Now we know the song with its single drum tracks, we know our drum equipment and the workflow to produce our own samples. So let's get into producing them. To save some time, I've already prepared the bass drum and snare drum samples. Let's listen to them. In this tune, we don't have a classic hi-hat sound. It's a shaker and a tambourine loop, which repeats every quarter note, as we may have figured out already. To get the dynamic and original sound and feel, it would not make sense to cut a sample with only 1 hit, because this would sound too static and not like the original loop. Neither it wouldn't make sense to cut all 4 hits, because this would lead to playing inefficiently and would not work with our current drum setup. So we can play this loop in 2 ways. Cut out a sample with the length of a quarter note and simply play it on every quarter note like this. Or secondly, if you have enough trigger inputs on your module to use the dual function of the pads, split the sample again into 2 parts. This will be 2 samples of 8 notes, which creates more of a live feeling but without losing the sound design. This is how it sounds like. And here's my drum hack for you. Triggering acoustic drums can lead into phase issues, especially with layering bass drum or snare drum sounds. it makes sense to give your acoustic bass drum or snare drum the main focus, because it sounds like it sounds. You can't change it fast enough during a show. For example, take a bass drum sample and reduce the low frequencies and maybe a little bit in the attack area around about 3 to 4 kHz. Then your acoustic bass drum is responsible for the low end and punch, and your sample for the sound design. Now here are all samples played on the drums. Let's listen to all E-drums first and then everything together. Now try out preparing the drum samples by your own with the original tracks I've used in this video. To download them, just click the link in the description below and have a lot of fun with it. I hope you've enjoyed this video, so hit subscribe and ring the bell. See you soon. Fred out.